Today we're going to be talking about how to predict times, temperatures, and events while we roast coffee at home. So stick around. All right, thanks for joining me today here at the Virtual Coffee Lab. One of the things I really appreciate about this community is I get to interact with people like you. I get to answer your questions, I get to ask you some questions, and I get to learn about some of your experiences. Some of you have shared some really cool things, anything from roasters that you've handmade yourself, you've cobbled together from various things in the kitchen, all the way through to people that have drum roasters and even professionals that are sharing some of their experiences. So it's really cool. I get to learn about you, and I get to learn about things that I haven't known before about roasting coffee. And then I get to share some of my own experiences and show you some of the things that I'm doing. So I love the interaction. It's awesome. And so today I had a viewer send a message into me, a question recently, and they asked, Mike, how do you predict the coffee roasting event times and temperatures? How can you predict those? They've seen me do that in some of my videos where I'm going to reach, this event at this time, and I'm going to be at this temperature within a couple of degrees. And how can I do that? And so I'm going to share that with you today, how I do that. And there's really just a few points in all this. The first point is that we need to know what these events are. We need to understand what coffee roasting events are. I did a whole video on that. You can check that out up here, coffee roasting events. It goes into detail, but ultimately we're dealing with the charged when you enter the beans into the roaster, dry end event, and that is when the coffee goes from its original green color and it's drying out and it turns yellow. That is dry end. And then first crack is when the pressure in the beans builds up, the moisture is evaporating, and the structure of the bean cracks, and you hear that cracking noise. That's first crack. Some people will go to second crack, and then ultimately the last event is drop, where we drop the coffee out of the roaster and begin the cooling process. So it's important for you to know what those events are and what they mean. Check that video out. Once we understand what the events are, then the really big question is, how do we plan our temperatures and our times for these events to take place? That's really kind of a hard question, but it's not that hard of a question. I've been doing this in all of the coffee roasting videos that you see me do. I'm trying to do that. So you're going to see bits and pieces of these answers in all of my videos. Really, what it comes down to is being familiar with your roaster and knowing how long it's going to take for you to be able to get your coffee dry within a reasonable amount of energy and a reasonable amount of time. So the first event is going to, after charge, is going to be the dry event. Before we even get to the dry event, we always need to use the same amount of coffee, roasting the same amount of coffee every time. This helps us gain familiarity, consistency, so when we do make changes to our power, there aren't any other changes that we've made. We can see how the changes impact our roast. So always use the same charge temperature. Then we're going to set our roasters to a temperature that will get our coffee dry within a reasonable amount of time. How do I know what that time is going to be? Well, we're going to pick that time, and then we're going to control our roaster so the coffee leads up to completing that event at that specific time. But before we do that, we need to know how our roaster behaves. So we're going to pay attention to three things: the color of the beans, the amount of energy we're using, and then lastly, the temperature. Those three things. I've had people say, oh, well, dry end, the temperature happens at this mark. And first crack, the temperature happens at this temperature. And the reality is that it might happen on their roaster at that temperature, but it may not happen on my roaster at that temperature because we're dealing with different environments, we're dealing with different roasters, and we're dealing with different amounts of coffee. There's variables that make a difference, and how hard how much energy we're applying, as I mentioned, all of those things are going to make a huge impact on the temperature result. But let's just say that you find that you can roast your coffee and get it dry so that it goes from green to yellow within 4 minutes. Okay, well, and that's not rushing it, and that's not using 100% power. Let's just say that you're using maybe 75 or 80% power for your roaster. It's got a lot more energy that you can apply to it, and so there you go. Okay, so what's the temperature going to be when you call dry? Well, you don't know. So when you get to dry, you look at your temperature. Let's say that temperature is 330 degrees. The next time you roast the coffee, if you're using the same charge temperature and the same amount of gas or electricity or your power setting, then you know that your coffee is going to reach dry at about 330 degrees. If you change the coffee to a different type of coffee, it may vary 5 or 10 degrees. If you change the amount of power to, let's just say that you start roasting it and you, for whatever reason, you find that you're lagging a little bit behind and you add more energy, you may find that the dry end event takes place at a slightly higher temperature, maybe 340 degrees. When you make changes to your roasting setup, that's going to influence the temperature that you reach that event at. So you're going to have a range, and I just mentioned 330 to 340 degrees. You may have a range on your roaster as well. After you do a few roasts, you'll start to get a feel for what that temperature range is. Okay? That means that while you're roasting coffee and you're seeing the roast progress during the dry phase, you can make adjustments to your heat to make sure that you're going to reach that dry event that takes place within a temperature range of 330 to 340 degrees within that 4-minute mark. And you might be 5 or 10 seconds off. That takes practice. And all of these steps take practice. But that's how I'm able to predict how I can get to the dry end event at a certain time. The same thing goes with first crack. We become familiar with color change of the beans, the sound of the beans as they're tumbling in the roaster, the smell that's taking place. All of these things are clues of how we are progressing towards first crack. Also, the temperature. As I mentioned, we may know that our coffee reaches first crack at a specific temperature. Again, that temperature is going to vary based on how hard you're pushing, how much energy you're applying to those beans. If I leave my roaster energy at 80%, then my first crack temperature is going to be about 360 degrees. But if I carefully adjust my temperatures so that I have the ample amount of time I need for flavor development, and I'm doing this properly, then my first crack temperature is going to be about 386 to 388 degrees. That's a 25 degree difference because of the amount of energy that I've been applying during my roast. Roasting consistently and watching your temperatures will help you understand when first crack is going to happen. So if I make the proper adjustments that I need to make on this drum roaster while I'm roasting, after I've reached dry end, I'm going to start to back my heat down a little bit, and that means that the temperature increase is going to start to slow. That means my rate of rise is going to go down. Then I am in control of my roaster, and I'm going to have a time span take place where my coffee flavors, the different reactions that are taking place, are going to have time to be able to do that. And I watch my temperature along the timeline, and I can predict that that temperature will reach that event at a specific time because I know that my temperature is going to be about 386 degrees. Same thing with drop. We're using our senses all along the way. We're smelling during dry, by the way, but that's not as critical. Color's more critical for dry. Smell and then ultimately hearing is going to be most critical for first crack, being able to hear first crack. And then during this development phase, where we're just about to drop the coffee, we want to watch our temperature, and we want to be smelling the coffee, and we want to be looking at the color. Those three things. That video that I did a few weeks ago, Color is King, that's a really important video because it talks about the importance of color and how ultimately color correlates to temperature, and all of that correlates to the change or the taste in the cup when we brew and drink the coffee. So we want to be able to roast this coffee to a certain temperature and a specific color. Unless you've got money to spend on a color meter, then you're just going to use either have a sample to be able to match, or just know by looking at the texture of the bean where you're at in this color progression. And then you're going to smell so that you'll know exactly when to drop this coffee. For me, on a temperature range on my roaster here, I'm roasting on a little bit lighter, on the lighter side of medium roast. And my temperature range is going to be anywhere from 396 degrees or 397 up to 400, 401. So that's about a 5-degree variance of a range where I will drop my coffee. And again, that there's a variable of the color as well as the temperature and the smell that I decide when to drop. I don't simply use temperature as my deciding factor. I use color and smell and the temperature to help me make my decision. So in each of these events, I'm using my senses, I'm using temperatures, and I know what those temperatures are because I'm familiar with my roaster. And so you need to practice while you're roasting, and you need to watch your temperatures. If you don't have the ability to read temperatures, you're using your senses. You're using your sight for color and texture. You're using your nose for smell, and you're using your ears. You can hear when the beans start to get lighter, or you can use your eyes when the beans start to loft more and they lose more weight if you're using an air roaster. There's a lot of different techniques for you to be able to use your senses to know the progress of the roast. And that's how I am able to predict my times and temperatures along the way while I roast. I'm very familiar with them because I use this roaster a lot. I've been using different roasters here on this channel because I want to learn what you're experiencing. Some of them are really good. They're fun to use. They roast some great coffee. I learned how to roast coffee on the Behmor and a hot air popcorn popper before I got my drum roaster, so I became familiar with the roasting process on the Behmor. Recently, I've been using the Hive and the Fresh Roast. They roast differently, but yet the concepts are still the same. So my point is, regardless of the roaster that you have, the principles I've shared can apply to just about every roaster that you can imagine. So what questions do you have about this? Do you plan your roasts? I guess that's a question for you. I plan my roasts depending upon the type of coffee, depending upon the density, the process that the coffee is. If it's a dry process coffee, a washed coffee, I may tweak my roast depending upon the tasting notes. Am I going after the light and fruity or the darker and the more savory notes in the type of coffee that I'm roasting? All of these things are, I'm going to make different slight adjustments. I'm not going to vary, any huge dramatic amounts, but there are going to be some changes so that I can bring out and highlight the origin, the flavor of the coffee, as well as some of the things that I'm trying to achieve in roasting that coffee. Like I said, if it's light and fruity and floral, or if it's more darker, more savory, maybe a little more earthy, then I'm going to roast the coffee a little differently, and I'm going to maybe use slightly different temperatures or different colors to be able to achieve what I want to achieve. I hope that makes sense. So are you planning your roast? Are you using your senses while you roast? How does that impact how you're making changes to your coffee? How about temperatures? Are you using temperatures all alone? Are you using those solely to make your decisions? I know some of you are because I've talked to you about it. And lastly, how is color ultimately impacting your decision on how far to go in the roast? We talked about that on the last video. If you care to share some comments on that, that would be awesome as well. We're starting to crawl towards that 10,000 subscriber mark. I'm really excited about that. Thank you for joining me today. Please hit the like button. That would help me out. And if you aren't a subscriber, please subscribe. And if you have questions, share them in the comments area. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.